So how should it change? Well, I actually think we need to think about changes in law and changes in us. So first about changes in law. 3 simple changes. Number 1, we have to solve the problem of orphans in copyright. And we need to solve the problem of orphans by making the copyright system, which is a property system, an efficient property system. The current copyright system is the most inefficient property system ever devised by man. If 75% of works cannot have their owners identified, the system is fundamentally failing. Now, what we need here is to create rules that impose some obligation on copyright holders to help make the ownership of copyrighted works transparent and knowable. They need to, as patent holders in the United States are required, maintain their copyright. So imagine a rule that said every 5 years you have to make sure that the work remains registered, or even every 14 years, registering the work or keeping the registration alive in a registry that was universal and open and free, a registry that would make it simple to know who owns what, so that the problem of orphans could not exist. If it's not in the registry, it's in the public domain, meaning those who care enough to have their work protected would register it, and those who didn't would not have their work protected anymore. That's one important change. Number 2, the law of copyright has got to give up its obsession with the copy. Copyright law that gets triggered on the production of a copy is, and this is a technical legal term, insane. It's an insane system for regulating culture in a digital age. The law instead needs to focus on a meaningful activity, and copying in a digital age is not a meaningful activity. The meaningful activity we find by looking at the context of use. So if you think about the difference between copying something as whole, or remixing it, and the difference between a professional and an amateur. That maps out these 4 categories. The way copyright law is devised today, it regulates all 4 of these categories in the same way. Never before in the history of culture has it purported to reach as broadly. It makes no sense to read this broadly now. Instead, certainly copyright law needs to regulate this category effectively. Professionals who are trying to control the distribution of copies to their work. That's the complete appropriate space for copyright to regulate strongly. But equally clearly, copyright law has got to leave alone amateurs who are engaging in the remix of other people's creative work. That remix harms no one, but imposing a system of heavy regulation on top of the remixers simply either stops the remixer from creating or turns him or her into a criminal. And then in these 2 middle categories, we need a mix between free and regulated uses. So amateurs who share the latest Madonna album with their 100,000 best friends, even if non-commercially, are obviously cannibalizing the market for that album, and that use needs to be regulated. And professionals need a free range to engage in remix, like Girl Talk, as I showed, requires. But some professional remixes, like making a movie out of a novel, I think continue to need regulation. But the point of this map is to suggest that the law needs to deregulate a significant space of culture, clarify the regulation, and focus it on places where it can do some good. Finally, the 3rd change, with respect to peer-to-peer piracy. So we're a decade into this war on peer-to-peer piracy. This war is a total failure. Now, the response of some to failed wars, maybe the response of the United States in particular, is to wage an ever more effective war despite its failure. But I think we need the opposite response here. Rather than suing more children, we need to sue for peace in this war. And we need to consider proposals that have been made for the last decade by scholars around the world for alternatives to protect the rights of copyright owners in the context of peer-to-peer file sharing. So proposals like compulsory licenses or voluntary collective licenses, proposals that would assure that owners of copyrighted works got compensated for the harm caused by peer-to-peer file sharing, while decriminalizing the acts of peer-to-peer file sharing. Now we need to recognize what the world would have been like if we had had those changes in place a decade ago. If 10 years ago we'd adopted these proposals, artists would have more money today, because of course artists get nothing from the existing world of peer-to-peer file sharing. And in the United States, when lawyers sue people for downloading, none of that money goes back to artists. It just goes to the lawyers or the recording industry. Number two, we would have had wider range of competition of businesses, not just the Apples or Microsofts of the world, but extraordinary range of businesses who could have operated in a space of clear legal regulation that would enable them to find new ways to make content accessible in a profitable way to users. But those two interests aren't the part that's most salient to me. The most important part to me is that if we had had this in place a decade ago, we would not have produced a generation of criminals. And that is the most important factor to focus on here, regardless of the profit of an industry, regardless of the opportunity for businesses to make more money, even regardless of the artists. The idea of producing a generation of criminals in any democracy ought to scare people who think about the importance of rule of law in a democracy. These are the changes in the law. Let me list some changes in us. First, we need to chill the control freaks in our societies. We need to respect that these emerging businesses, these hybrids, are different. They function differently. And how the business relates with the sharing economy needs to be sensitive to that difference. So, for example, you can think about a kind of hybrid that I call a Darth Vader hybrid. So I unfairly pick this from a particular example. Darth Vader hybrid, Darth Vader comes from these licenses that assign all the rights of the creativity back to the original owner. So for example, Star Wars runs a mashup site where the owner of this 30-year-old franchise wants to invite young kids to come in and to remix the Star Wars images and make this remix available to their friends. And in the context of remixing, they can upload their own music or upload their own pictures and include that in their Star Wars mashup. But if you read the license for this site, Lucas owns all the mashups himself, even the rights to distribute beyond the site. Lucas has complete control over that. And even stuff that you add to the site, music you've composed, Lucas has a worldwide, perpetual, free license to exploit that creativity without any compensation back to the original author. This is not a site that respects creators' rights. This is instead, just a little unfairly, a kind of digital sharecropping, where all the work is done by people who get no rights in return. Now, the problem of this relationship between commercial entities and the sharing economy is becoming increasingly salient, especially in the internet. Malik described this on his blog. Does this culture of participation build business on our collective backs? Whatever the collective efforts are, they are going to boost the economic values of those entities. Will we share their upside? Not likely. The point is, this rhetoric increasingly asks the question, what is a just hybrid? What does a just hybrid look like? And the interesting point is that we don't actually know yet what a just hybrid looks like, but I suggest that whatever a just hybrid looks like, it doesn't look like that.